To those who've just joined, good afternoon and good morning again, and welcome to this important anniversary event. Happy Domestic Workers' Day to all of you here today. My name is Anna Olsen, and I work for the ILO's Triangle in ASEAN program, and I'm absolutely honored to be emceeing today's event. 10 years ago, a full decade ago today, the Domestic Workers Convention was adopted at the International Labour Conference, recognizing for the first time in international law that domestic work is work and that domestic workers are entitled to all of the fundamental labour rights just as other workers. It was a momentous and a happy occasion, and it changed the way that the global community approaches this essential sector. For those who were involved in advocating for and negotiating the convention, it was the culmination of absolutely years of work. And for those who are here present today in this event and were part of those efforts, we salute you and our gratitude is eternal. There can be little doubt that the convention was an achievement that changed the world of work forever and for the better. We're here today to launch a report. 10 years on after the convention, the ILO has completed a comprehensive piece of research that assesses how far we've come in protecting domestic workers, what's changed, what hasn't, and what emerging issues are being faced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as a result of use of platform or on-demand work modalities, as a result of increased migration and a host of other new factors that have arisen over the last 10 years. In Asia and the Pacific, Triangle and ASEAN, and we're very pleased to be able to work with the authors of the global report to produce an Asia Pacific summary, which we're launching today. You can see the cover of the report on the screen now, and it can be accessed via the link on the screen. And we're also putting the link in the chat right now to the Asia Pacific summary and also to the global report. If you would like hard copies of the report, please email us or leave your address in the chat box and we'll find a way to send these to you. And we have some of our Triangle and ASEAN staff monitoring the chat box, so you can put your address in there and we will record it. For today's event, you are going to hear opening remarks from the Deputy Regional Director of the ILO's Office for Asia and the Pacific, followed by a presentation from one of the esteemed authors of the report, summarizing the report findings and giving all of you new fuel for your advocacy for domestic workers' rights. We're also going to hear from the Regional Director of the International Domestic Workers Federation, the peak workers organization for domestic workers. We're going to hear from Director Alice Visperas about the experiences of the Philippines as the only country in the region to have ratified the convention. And finally, from Liesl Galdo, the coordinator of AMPO, an organization of migrant domestic workers in Malaysia. And we're thrilled to have all of these speakers here with us today. It is quite a full agenda, but we hope to also have some time for questions and answers, provided, of course, that all of our speakers keep to their time limits. A gentle reminder that you have just 8 minutes each for the panel. Claire, we've given you a little bit more time for the report summary. After the panel and the Q&A, we're going to see the worldwide premiere of a new video that celebrates domestic work and calls on all of us to reinvigorate our efforts to improve the conditions of work for domestic workers and the understanding of the contribution that domestic workers make to all our societies and indeed to our lives. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kunpin, as we know her. But Ms. Panuda Bunpala was appointed the Deputy Regional Director of the ILO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in 2018. Prior to that, she held the position of Director of the ILO Decent Work Technical Support Team for South Asia and the Country Office for India. Ms. Bunpala has been with the ILO since 1995, serving in Geneva, Bangkok, Dhaka, and New Delhi. So without any more from me, I'd like to hand it over to Pin for her opening remarks. Thank you, Pin.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking your time to come together today as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of ILO's Convention on Domestic Workers, or in short, Convention 189 or C189. On June 16, 2011, some of you in this room were in Geneva at that time and witnessed the historic adoption of the Convention 189 at the International Labour Conference. The convention affirmed that domestic work is work and that domestic workers are entitled to the same protections as all other workers, such as weekly rest, protection from discrimination and dismissal, fair pay, and the right to organize and to advocate collectively for improvements of working conditions in the sector. To the domestic workers and their supporters, thank you so much for your work, for your resilience, and for your ongoing commitment to ensure that domestic work is decent work. It is an honor for us to walk alongside you, working together for equality and decent work for domestic workers. To our tripartite constituents, CSOs, and many other stakeholders, you are here today because you are committed and deeply engaged in the protection of the rights of domestic workers. Thank you so much for your hard work for so many years, and let's continue to work together. As Anna mentioned, 10 years have passed since the adoption of Convention 189. It is important that we look back and see how far progress has been made. When the ILO began stock taking, how far we have come in the last decade, the answer is still not far enough. Of course, there has been progress. And in our region, the Philippines has ratified Convention 189, and significant improvements to the legal framework protecting domestic workers has been made in several other countries, and more still underway. But implementation gaps, the difference between the law on the books and the day-to-day experiences of domestic workers remain a challenge. As do tackling some of the underlying social norms that persist in framing work within the home or work done by women or migrants as somehow less worthy or less contributory to our societies. And we all know that domestic work makes a vital contribution to our life, to the societies, and to the economy. COVID-19 clearly showed that domestic work is essential in its very nature. But over the last 18 months, the pandemic also demonstrated even more starkly that we owe domestic workers more. We owe them better. During the early stages of COVID-19, over 70% of domestic workers were severely impacted, having lost their jobs or lost hours of work. Too many of these workers left without due wages or any compensation. And for those who were informal workers or without contracts, no way to claim their lost pay. Many migrant domestic workers were left with irregular migration status after losing their jobs, finding themselves at increased risk of exploitation, deportation, and in many critical cases, even starvation. The ILO Director General said at the launching of the global report yesterday, and I quote, "The crisis has highlighted the urgent need to formalize domestic work to ensure the access to decent work, starting with extension and implementation of labor and social security laws to all domestic workers, end quote. Beyond the pandemic shining a light on our homes, this anniversary is also a moment to face the future of domestic work. Many of our societies are aging, and almost all of us will need at some stage in our life to be careful, whether that is in an institution or at home. We are all going to need care, and that will most likely be delivered, at least in part, by a domestic worker. So this issue is personal for all of us as well. As societies, we need to invest in the care economy to prepare for the care crisis faced by the aging societies. We need to recognize that migrant domestic workers often fill gaps in this sector and ensure that their migration and their jobs are safe and fair. The conditions of work in these jobs are a proxy measure for the health, equality, equity in our societies. I'm very pleased to be launching the Asia Pacific summary of the global stock-taking efforts by the ILO, looking back at progress over the last decade, making decent work a reality for domestic workers, progress and prospect 10 years after the adoption of the Domestic Workers Convention number 189 is a phenomenal undertaking. I congratulate the authors on their achievement. The report findings will give new impetus to persistent challenges and importantly, presents new estimates for the numbers of domestic workers in our region and around the world. We will hear more about the trends and the ongoing challenges during the presentations today. We hope that this report gives you some new tools to continue the fight. We will continue to collaborate with all countries for future ratification of Convention 189 as the critical first step in reducing the informality of the sector and realizing decent work for domestic workers. In closing, I'd like to thank you all once again for your participation. I'd like to thank my triangle team at the ILO, my colleagues from ILO in Geneva, for joining us. And also I'd like to thank all speakers. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Kun Pin, for such inspiring remarks. It's always heartening to know that the ILO management is so strongly committed to the domestic work issue. But without any more further ado, I want to pass over to Claire Hobden so we can hear as much as possible about the new figures and analysis of the challenges that are in the global report. So our next speaker is Claire Hobden. She's the coordinator of the ILO's office-wide strategy to make decent work a reality for domestic workers at the ILO and has close to 20 years of experience working on domestic work at local and international levels. Shortly after joining the ILO in 2009, Claire provided technical support in the negotiations of the ILO Domestic Workers Convention and has since been working on its promotion and implementation. Claire is responsible for coordinating the ILO's work on domestic work, providing technical assistance to governments, workers, and employers, and developing knowledge on how to make decent work a reality for domestic workers. She is the lead author of Making Decent Work a Reality for Domestic Workers, Progress and Prospects 10 years after the adoption of the ILO's Convention number 189. We're also joined today by Florence Bonnet, who is one of the other authors of the report. And before we even hear from them, I am extremely grateful for all of their coordination and support throughout this process. With that, over to you, Claire, for the key findings and key challenges in this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for the opportunity to share these findings. Florence and I have put a lot of passion into this report because celebrating the 10th anniversary of the convention is one of the most important milestones for the ILO in recent years. Convention 189 is pretty much the last convention that was adopted before Convention 190 on violence and harassment. And it's also a very important convention because it protects a group of workers that has historically been undervalued and unrecognized in the laws. So with that in mind, with this report, what we really wanted to do was to take stock of the progress made since the adoption of the convention and see where some of the gaps remained in order to make decent work a reality for domestic workers. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully this will work smoothly. Okay. Great. So if everybody
Yes, Paul.
Anna, can you just confirm if you can see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. And if I, Anna, I think it might be better if you use yours. I'm really sorry about this.
No problem.
Thankfully, we were prepared for this eventuality. So I'll just go ahead and start in the meantime. Okay, so as I was saying, we wanted to measure the progress made in the implementation of Convention 189, because essentially Convention 189 really is an instrument that was establishing the basic elements of decent work for domestic workers. It contains the information that governments need to ensure that domestic workers have rights equal to other workers. And in that sense, it is also trying to ensure that domestic workers enjoy an adequate level of protection by the laws. But it's very important to remember that it also seeks that these rights and protections become a reality. So the report really looks at three elements in three parts. The first part provides global and regional estimates on the number of domestic workers. The second part provides information on the extent to which domestic workers are covered by labor and social security laws. And the third and final part looks at the implementation of those laws. Now, when we talk about implementation, what we are looking at is the actual working conditions of domestic workers. So working in terms of working time, in terms of wages, and in terms of the share of domestic workers who are still in informal employment, meaning that they're not registered to Social Security or their employers are not making contributions to Social Security. So the presentation will follow roughly that outline. We will start with the global and regional estimates. And then in each section, I will provide some key data from the global level as well as from the regional level. I'm hoping to give you a sense of where Asia and the Pacific lies within the bigger picture. So to start with the global estimates, I think you can go to the next slide, Anna. Yeah, so the objectives of the report structure and the next one would be perfect. Great. So globally, the report needed to start with a clear definition of domestic work. Now, Convention 189 defines domestic work as work performed in or for a household or households. And that has often meant to a lot of people only those domestic workers hired directly by households. But in fact, the scope of the definition of Convention 189 is broader. It includes domestic workers who are hired through service providers, whether they're employed by the service provider or by the household, or if there's more complexity in the employment relationship, these are domestic workers. So this global estimate for the first time includes domestic workers hired directly by households, as well as those hired through service providers. As you can see on the slide, there's 75.6 million domestic workers working in the world. So this figure includes live in and live out, part-time, full-time, regardless of the number of hours worked, as long as domestic workers considered it to be their main job. It also includes domestic workers working over the age of 15, so it does not include child domestic workers. As you can see also on the slide, there is quite an important variation in the size of the domestic workforce across the world. So while there are 75.6 million domestic workers globally, and they represent 4.5% of employees, this proportion reaches more than 1/3 of women employees in the Arab states and 17.8% in Latin America and the Caribbean. Women continue to make up the majority of the sector, so 76.2%, meaning that 1/4 of domestic workers are men. And I think it's important to note that the share of women among domestic workers is very high in some regions, like in Latin America and in Europe. But in the Arab states, men outnumber women, and they represent 63.4% of the sector in the Arab states. And in Asia and the Pacific, the region is the largest employer of domestic workers. And it's home to 38.3 million domestic workers, or 50% of the domestic workers worldwide. There are, I'm so sorry, Anna, I see you jumping around. If you can just back up, yeah, I think we'll stay on the gender dimension. That'd be perfect. So again, Asia and the Pacific is the largest employer of domestic workers. But in terms of share of employment, domestic work represents a smaller share. So it represents 2% of employment on the continent and in the region. So as in most other regions in Asia and the Pacific, domestic work is performed largely by women. They make up 78.4% of the sector. But the region is also the largest employer of male domestic workers. So there is a gender dimension that we are still learning about. But the estimates this time really found that there was, that in some sub-regions in particular, that there are more men than we thought to be in the sector originally. So in Southern Asia, for example, they account for 42.6% of the 9 million domestic workers in the sub-region. In contrast, in Southern Eastern Asia and the Pacific and in Eastern Asia, they make up a larger majority of the sector. So if you can go to the next slide. What we see here, and the slides will be available so you can look at all of this more carefully, but what you see here is that domestic workers, male and female domestic workers, tend to be clustered in particular occupations. So men, domestic workers, tend to work more as gardeners and chefs and chauffeurs, whereas women tend to work as cleaners or direct caregivers. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So now we will look at the extent of protection by labor and social security laws. This is a section of the report that focuses on progress made and the situation of domestic workers today. So we look at the percentage of countries that cover domestic workers and also the percentage of domestic workers who are covered as a result. We look at this for wages, working time, as well as maternity protection and social security. So this first slide, we see the extent of coverage by national laws. So globally, what we see is that there has been an increase in the percentage of domestic workers covered by key working conditions laws. Here, what we tried to measure was the extent to which whether domestic workers were covered by general labor laws, specific labor laws, or a combination of the two, or if they were excluded altogether. So I think it's important to note that globally, there's been a reduction of 16% of domestic workers who are excluded. So there has been an improvement in the percentage of domestic workers and in the percentage of domestic workers who are covered generally by the scope of labor laws. And as you can see, there is a tendency for domestic workers to be covered by a combination of the general labor laws and special regulations. I need to stress the fact that this doesn't mean, it's not a reflection of the level of protection that domestic workers enjoy. In other words, they could be included in the general labor law, but excluded from a lot of specific provisions. And I think this is something that we see quite often. So, you know, although 88% of domestic workers are covered by the law in some form or another, it doesn't quite give us the depth of information that we need to understand the actual extent of protection. So there are really important gaps that remain. And I think if we turn to Asia and the Pacific, we see that 61.5% of domestic workers remain fully excluded from the labor law. This proportion is twice as low when China is excluded from the estimates. It's important to keep in mind that China obviously has a big influence over the estimates in the sector. So the majority of domestic workers in the region who are covered can be found in Southeastern Asia and the Pacific, and they tend to be covered by a combination of general labor laws and specific laws or subordinate regulations. Globally, if you can go to the next slide, globally, there has been the most progress made in the area of working time, starting with periods of weekly rest. So the extent of coverage, we'll see weekly rest on the next slide, but the extent of coverage has been highest there. In terms of normal weekly hours, as we can see, there are a significant number of domestic workers who are covered globally. But in Asia and the Pacific, there are very, very few domestic workers who are covered by these laws. So it means that their working hours are essentially unlimited in the laws. If you can go to the next slide. Oh yes, so if you just go back once. The images on the right hand side show the percent change in coverage. So we've only been able to do that for the moment at the global level, but I think it's interesting to see the increase in the percentage of domestic workers who are covered by those laws globally. Now, if we can return to weekly rest. So here again, it's the area where the most domestic workers are covered globally. There has been a lot of progress in this sense. If you click on the button again, we'll see that there's been an increase of 21% of domestic workers covered by weekly rest. If you, and this is on an equal that they have the same right to weekly rest as other workers. So the dark green represents equality. The light green presents the information on rights to weekly rest that are less favorable than for other workers. So again, there's a tendency to ensure equal rights with other workers when laws have adopted laws and policies. In Asia and the Pacific, still, in contrast to the rest of the world, the percentages are very low, as you can see. Even considering Arab states, the number of domestic workers who are protected in terms of weekly rest is very low, 20% if you exclude China and 18% if you include China. So turning now to annual leave. Paid annual leave is another very important right for domestic workers. Here we see that while the majority of countries still ensure equal entitlements to the right to paid annual leave, there is a small percentage of countries that provide less favorable rights and still 11% of countries that exclude domestic workers. And once again, we see this very stark regional difference between the Americas, particularly in Europe and Central Asia, and in contrast, the regions of Arab states, Asia and the Pacific, where the extent of protection is lower. So in Asia and the Pacific, there are 19% of domestic workers who enjoy the same rights as other workers when it comes to paid annual leave, but 63% are excluded completely from these laws. If you can go to the next slide. So now we have two areas with respect to wages. We looked at minimum wages and payment in kind. I'll go over this I mean, when we look at payment in kind, you'll see that there's a very close linkage between the right to receive the full minimum wage in kind. And as we know, there's a high percentage of domestic workers who receive a big share of their wage in kind. So I think it's an important link to make. But to start with, in terms of minimum wages, again, there's a high percentage of countries globally that ensure a minimum wage that is equal to that of other workers. So it's 64.8% of countries that afford equal rights with respect to minimum wage. And a smaller percentage, 9.3%, that provide a lower minimum wage than for other workers. Sometimes it's difficult to compare, particularly when countries have many sectoral minimum wages, but we did our best to try to estimate roughly what the levels were in those cases. And again, here, if you look at Asia and the Pacific in the greater context, we only see 11% of domestic workers who are covered by the laws concerning minimum wages, and 7% who have a minimum wage that's lower than for other workers. Still 64% are fully excluded from the minimum wage. If you can click through. And so with minimum wages comes this notion also of whether or not that full minimum wage can be paid in kind. So payment in kind can be paid as a portion of the full wage or as a portion of the minimum wage. What we were interested in especially is to see if the domestic workers could receive their full minimum wage in kind, in cash. So what you see here is that 37% of countries that provide the minimum wage allow for that full minimum wage to be paid in cash. 36% of countries that allow the minimum wage allow for a portion of the minimum wage to be paid in kind. Now, this is a little bit complicated sometimes. I'm available for any questions on this if we want to come back on it later. What you see in gray then is that 13.9% and 6.5% of countries don't afford a minimum wage to domestic workers at all. And so whether or not payment in kind was allowed is also, it's actually particularly relevant in those countries. So I think some of the most important information to take from this slide is that those countries where no minimum wage exists or where the domestic workers are excluded from the minimum wage, and in addition allow for a portion of the wage to be paid in kind, those are the domestic workers that are in the most vulnerable positions. And I think this is something that we see in some countries, including in Asia and the Pacific. So there's 64% of domestic workers who are excluded from the minimum wage. And within that 64%, it is also likely that a portion of the wage can be paid in kind. So if you could go to the next slide. So the area of coverage of maternity protection is divided into two. There's maternity leave and maternity cash benefits. So of course, the right to maternity leave should include, maternity leave by itself is the right to take time off during your maternity. The right to maternity cash benefits is the right to have access to income support while you're on that maternity leave. So of course, the two should go together if they're going to be effective. So with respect to maternity leave, again, we see a big percentage of domestic workers, of countries that provide a legal right and equal rights to maternity leave for domestic workers. But again, in Asia and the Pacific, that number drops down to 19%. It's also one of the areas where we've seen less progress over the last years. As you can see, there's only been an increase of 4.7% of domestic workers who are covered by maternity leave. If you can go to the next slide. So in terms of maternity cash benefits, the percentages are about the same. 68.5% of domestic workers of countries provide maternity cash benefits. But again, in Asia and the Pacific, this number drops down to 18%. If you can go to the next slide. In terms of Social Security coverage, it goes without saying that the right to Social Security is absolutely essential. During this COVID-19 pandemic, so many domestic workers were left unemployed and without recourse to Social Security. It's not surprising when you see that globally only, let's see, 14.9% of countries globally provide domestic workers with all the benefits of Social Security. This is the important number to keep in mind. It's 14.9% of countries that allow all benefits for domestic workers. And in Asia and the Pacific, that number drops down to 3%. We also looked at the number of countries that provide at least one benefit in Social Security. So for example, unemployment insurance or maternity or pension. And so in Asia and the Pacific, there are 36% of countries that afford at least one benefit. But of course, this level is quite insufficient. If you can go to the next slide. So just to end, obviously the picture at the legal level, at the global level, seems rather positive, but we really needed to know whether these rights were translating into reality. So if you could go to the next slide. We looked at informality in domestic work first and foremost. So we measure informality by whether or not domestic workers are contributing to Social Security, or rather if their employers are contributing to Social Security. That's our primary indicator. So globally, 81% of the world's domestic workers are in informal employment. And in Asia and the Pacific, that number is roughly the same, a little bit higher. It's 84.3%. So that's the share of employment among domestic workers. Underneath, you see that compared to the share of informality among other employees. So in Asia and the Pacific, informality among employees more generally, or all workers rather, is 67%. And then the share among employees is 52.8%. So if you could go to the next slide. We looked at the actual working time of domestic workers. Now, I think in general, what we were saying is that domestic workers are far more likely to work outside of what are considered to be normal hours of work. So between 35 and 48 hours per week. Most domestic workers are working either very long hours or very short hours. And in Asia and the Pacific, you can see that the majority are really working particularly long hours. So there's a sort of, again, big differences across regions that are very interesting to look at. We won't have time today. But I think it's a chart that starts to show some of the working conditions of domestic workers as compared to other employees. So if you can go to the next slide. We also looked at the working time of domestic workers. So globally, domestic workers earn about 56% of the average monthly wage of other workers. But if you, this is working time still actually. So this is looking at the comparison between informal and formal domestic workers, my apologies. So Asia and Pacific is looking at, so basically we know that the working conditions of domestic workers within the formal and informal are they're quite comparable, but the working conditions of informal domestic workers tend to be much poorer than among formal domestic workers. So here you see again in Asia and the Pacific that the working hours of informal domestic workers are much longer even than for formal domestic workers. So if you could go to the next slide. Now we are looking at the actual wages of domestic workers. So the average monthly wages of domestic workers are much lower than the average monthly wages of other employees. Globally, they earn about 56% of average monthly wages of other employees. And if you look at Asia and the Pacific, you'll see that domestic workers earn 65% of the average wages of other employees. Now, this may seem high, but if you take into account the long working hours of domestic workers that we saw on the other slide, actually it means that their hourly wages are still very low. So it's not an indication of the fact that they're earning more. If you could go to the next slide, please. So finally, there are, well, a little bit of interesting findings on why the wages of domestic workers are so low. Oftentimes domestic workers, the wages of domestic workers are considered to be low because of the fact that most domestic workers are women or because it's low skilled. But in fact, we did some analysis and found that the gap, the wage gap between domestic workers and other employees does not actually differ significantly. So in other words, gender and skill, while they do play a role in the fact that the wages are low overall, they don't fully explain why the wages of domestic workers are lower than for other workers. So if you could just skip forward because I know we're out of time. I just wanted to say a few words about occupational safety and health and violence and harassment. We don't have full estimates, data on these two areas, but the report does finally look a little bit more into the occupational safety and health risks and the good practices that can be used to try to close some of these legal gaps. So similarly, for violence and harassment, which is on the next slide, we've also done a little bit more research on the types of abuse that domestic workers face and some of the practices and measures that can be taken to close those gaps. So finally, the report does look at the impact of COVID-19. I'm not going to go into this, but needless to say that domestic workers were far more likely to lose their jobs than for other employees. And because domestic workers were in formal employment, they often did not have access to Social Security, as we heard earlier in the presentation. So if you can move forward. So the last part of the report includes good practices, which is largely, I think, what we'll be hearing about for the remainder of this session. So I just wanted to make one point that the report tries to measure the extent to which domestic workers are in the informal economy due to gaps in legal coverage or due to gaps in implementation. And I think it goes without saying that in Asia, the first step is really the extension of legal protections that is going to be necessary. Other regions might now be focusing on implementation. In Asia and the Pacific, clearly legal needs to come first and implementation needs to come shortly afterwards. If you can just go to the final. So in terms of closing legal gaps, there are a lot of good practices that we look at in the report in terms of wages and working time. We really highlight the fact that regulations on working time need to include they need to take into account both the wages of domestic workers and the working time to make sure that they're coherent. In other words, if domestic workers are limited to working 45 hours, or let's say that the normal weekly hours in a country are set at 60 or 70 hours a week, and their wages are set very low, then those are some of the worst working conditions. Conversely, if the wages are set on an hourly basis and the normal hours of week are limited to 45, then we start seeing something that looks a little bit more like decent work for domestic workers. So these are some of the legal measures that we suggest. In terms of closing implementation gaps, we do look more carefully at tools that can be used to measure working time, and the use of pay slips and standard contracts. We also talk a lot about the importance of public awareness raising, not just once, but regularly, to remind employers of domestic workers about their obligations. Now, if you can skip to Social Security. In terms of the implementation gaps for Social Security, there's a full report on this topic that will be coming out later this year. But for now, you can refer to the fact that it's important to remove administrative barriers, really simplify the process of registration for employers and for domestic workers to register and to make contributions. It's important to adapt the contributions that they make to Social Security without lowering the level of benefits that they receive in exchange. So sometimes this change in the level of contributions can be financed through subsidies to help domestic workers and employers be able to afford the contributions to Social Security. And sometimes they're combined with fiscal incentives, so to make formal employment more attractive financially for both workers and employers. Finally, across the board, it's really important to build up the capacity of labor inspectorates and other labor institutions, particularly with respect to occupational safety and health. The need to really identify occupational safety and health risks is essential. And I think that in addition to identifying the risks and raising public awareness, there does need to be room for labor inspectorates to identify cases where there has been a violation of some sorts. If you could go to the next slide. So this is particularly true for violence and harassment. We need to see a lot more training of the labor inspectorates and also to ensure that they have the capacity and the mandate to identify cases of violence and harassment. And in addition to that, I think that with violence and harassment in particular, we need to work on denormalizing it. And this needs to include, to some degree, identifying collectively what constitutes acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and then making sure that the legal frameworks also understand what that unacceptable behavior is, and that the legal frameworks then allow domestic workers to access justice for those forms of violence and harassment. So if you could just go to the next slide. Yeah, so finally, all of this works within the scope of formalization. A lot of these are the same elements that we've seen before, so we can move to the next slide. But really the underpinning lesson learned from the report really is the importance of voice and representation among domestic workers and employers in the sector. So we are seeing a huge growth in the number of domestic workers associations and unions, thanks very much to the International Domestic Workers Federation. They play an absolutely essential role, and they also genuinely need employer counterparts if we want to foresee a situation in which laws and policies are really fully adapted to the sector. In countries where you have both employers and domestic workers organizations, they have really pushed for more comprehensive and supportive policies for families that need to hire domestic workers, and they've even achieved collective bargaining in some countries. So with that, I'm going to end, and I'm very sorry for some of the technical difficulties and for going a little bit over time. You all are actually the first ones to receive this presentation, which is part of the reason why we're still working through some of the kinks. but I hope that you can appreciate the fact that this is really brand new information, and I'm really excited to see how it gets taken up at the national level to create dialogue and to really advance the agenda in your home countries.
Thank you so much, Claire. And once again, congratulations on such an impressive report. I think we can see from the slides, at the very least, how much information there is in that report and how much we will all be able to start to pick our important pieces of information for our country or our issue that we might be looking to advocate for in this anniversary year. Thanks also to Florence, who I know also put an awful lot of work into this report. I remind you that we will share the link to download both the global report and the Asia Pacific summary in the chat. So I hope that you will all download it over the next hour or so. But turning to advocacy and taking up from where Claire really left off, our next speaker is Ms. Ip Fish, the Asia Regional Coordinator of the International Domestic Workers Federation, or IDWF. You can see her on the ILO's webpage for domestic workers, and you can see her in action, in fact, negotiating the convention on that page. The IDWF itself has currently 81 affiliates that are domestic workers unions and organizations across 63 countries. And in case she didn't have enough to do with 81 affiliates, Fish is also the founding organizer for the Hong Kong Domestic Workers General Union, established in 2001, and the Hong Kong Federation of Asian Domestic Workers, which many of you will know as FADWU, founded in 2010. FADWU organizes local and migrant domestic workers of all nationalities in Hong Kong. Fish has worked with the IDWF since 2009, including, as mentioned, towards the adoption of C189. So we owe her an awful lot, and over to you, Fish.
Thank you so much. Thanks the ILO for organizing this sharing for us to have an overview on the progress that we have made. Although for Asia, we are still very much lagged behind in regards to the protection of domestic workers in the region, when we can recall what Claire has mentioned, that 84.3% domestic workers in Asia are still in the informal sector, meaning they are not protected. And almost 100%, only 0.3% in the Arab states are formalized. And in these Middle East and the Gulf, there are also many migrant domestic workers from the Asia region. So when we are talking about the region, the Asia Pacific are the biggest host of the domestic workers, but the rise of domestic workers are still left behind. We have still very much of work to do. So before that, I'd like to call upon Myrtle, the IDWF president, to say hello to everybody joining us from South Africa. Myrtle, are you here? Can you open your camera and microphone to say hello to our sisters and brothers in the region? I hope Myrtle is here. Hello. Okay, maybe some connection issue. So anyway, joining to you also with many of us from the IDWF sisters and brothers. Myrtle is joining us, and Elizabeth will join in a while. So for me today, I will share some challenges in the global organizing and some reflection, especially in the times of COVID-19 pandemic. And first of all, is really the C189 has given us a big push in regards to the domestic workers organizing and the rise of domestic workers. When the IDWF was established in 2013, some 8 years ago, IDF have 47 affiliates organizing 300,000 domestic workers. And now we have already 81 affiliates organizing over 600,000 domestic workers around the world. And in Asia, we have a big increase, almost a double. Now we have 190,000 domestic workers among our 17 affiliates in 12 countries. The C189 really give a big push, especially in Asia, because as you can see from the presentation from Claire, you see always the bar from the data is always gray, meaning the exclusion of domestic workers from many basic rights like day offs and minimum wage, etc. And many Asian affiliates and domestic workers are organized during the times when we had the discussion of the C189. Like in Sri Lanka, the Domestic Workers Union was especially using the adoption of C189 in 2012 to tell the government that, you know, there is a C189, domestic workers are recognized, and in your constitution, actually in your law, you do have domestic workers recognized as workers. So they were using the C189 as a reason to register the Domestic Workers Union in Sri Lanka. So several domestic workers organizations was formed along the way in Cambodia, India, the Union Federation, National Federation was formed. United was formed alongside the adoption of the Kasambahay Bill, the Domestic Workers Bill as well. Thailand, the Network of Domestic Workers, and in Taiwan, Macau, they are also forming organizations. So it's a big encouragement of the C189 for domestic workers to be organized. And they have been telling the governments and the public that domestic workers are workers. Despite that, we should have to have a look on the trend of domestic workers in the region. And we can see there's an increased number of domestic workers, especially on migrant domestic workers. Over the past decade, we can see the new sending countries of migrant domestic workers like Bangladesh, Cambodia, etc. They are raising for having remittance from the migrant domestic workers, but at the same time, we are also raising to the bottom in regards to the domestic workers' rights, because in the majority of the destination, the domestic workers' rights are still not covered in the labor law. I'd like to point to the fundamental principle of rights stated by the ILO, which is the freedom of association, elimination of child labor and discrimination, and no forced labor. But then domestic workers are still facing these kind of issues. We still have a lot of Asian countries that domestic workers cannot register a trade union. The Cambodia is already a case which is being examined in the current session of the International Labour Conference on violation of C87. And one of the situations is that domestic workers in Cambodia cannot register a union. And that was also stated in the Committee of Experts in the ILO. And besides that, Bangladesh, Thailand, they are still cannot register union. And in some cases, migrant domestic workers, they cannot form their own trade union, but they need to have a local domestic workers in the leadership, like in Taiwan and also Malaysia. And in other issue, main challenge for organizing of domestic workers is that we don't have enough time. There's no day off. So it's very difficult to meet up the domestic workers to have activities, to aware them about their rights. And from Claire report, it was also mentioned that around 64% of the domestic workers in Asia don't enjoy day off, and many of them work long hours. And in the COVID-19 has heightened the expectation because of the lockdown. And even if the countries do not have total lockdown, the government is still calling upon the migrant domestic workers to stay at home. Like that is happening in Hong Kong, Taiwan as well. And there has been increased discrimination, like for example, mandatory COVID-19 test, or they must have the test or vaccination before they can get a visa for the migrant domestic workers. The discrimination has been heightened so much that one of the survey done by Federal Hong Kong, the domestic workers expressed that 58% of the domestic workers expressed that they feel they face more discrimination. And with this, there are also situations when the domestic workers lost their job. Many of them lost their job, and even they still keep their job. There are wage theft when domestic workers, migrants were sent home without money paid. And in India, one of the survey by SEWA mentioned that in May last year, only 20% of their members got paid for their wage. And this is very serious in this situation of COVID-19. And that gives implication to our organizing. Many of our affiliates were not able to collect their membership dues because of the loss of income of the domestic workers. And the social protection is an issue, as also mentioned by Claire. Most of the domestic workers are excluded from the social protection, or they are not mandatory. And during the COVID-19, when they fell ill, they cannot get medical coverage, like the case in the Middle East. They were ill and then they were deported home. So these are some major challenges. The pandemic just heightened the abuses and exploitation that we face. But despite that, the organizing has been increased, as I shared, and the rise of domestic workers has been also increased due to more voices, and the domestic workers can have their representative organization. They can tell the real situation. I remember the previous ILO report on the legal coverage of rights enjoyed by domestic workers like 8 or 9 years ago. It was 88% exclusion in the Asia region, but now is 64%. So there has been some improvement in the region, although still a lot are excluded from the labor rights. And for this, we have to keep on our organizing, keep networking with the trade union and NGOs, and we hope more domestic workers can register their organization into union and join the labor union movement, and to push for more rights and be protected. So for the ILO, we will continue to support domestic workers in the organizing, and also to consolidate their organization to have their rights and to have power collectively to make the changes. So thank you very much. Thanks once again for the ILO to organize this, to allow us to learn from all this data and the progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fish. For those of you who haven't done it, I can assure you that working with IDWF is an absolute pleasure. And we really appreciate Fish and Myrtle and Elizabeth taking your time to be present today on what is probably the biggest day of the year for IDWF. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to keep us moving on to our speaker from the government of the Philippines, Director Alice Visperas. We're very pleased to be able to welcome government representation to this event, and thrilled, of course, that you are representing the only government in the region that has ratified Convention 189. Alice Vesperos is the Director of the International Labour Affairs Bureau, or ILAB, in the Department of Labour and Employment for the Philippines. She's been a public servant for over 23 years and rose through the ranks of the DOLE personnel, having started as project-based, then as Labour and Employment Officer, moving to Executive Assistant until she became Senior Labour and Employment Officer in the International Labour Affairs Bureau. She's also worked with the Philippines Overseas Labour Officers, known as the POLOs, and the ASEAN concerns of the Bureau. She was part of the organizing team of the Philippines chairmanship of the 50th anniversary of ASEAN, and an integral part of the organizing team of the Philippines hosting of the Abu Dhabi Dialogue in 2012. Over to you, Alice, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Anna. Warm greetings to all the guests and participants of this significant event. And in behalf of the Department of Labor and Employment, I am deeply honored to share the impact of the ratification of ILO Convention 189, the Philippine experience. This is indeed a good opportunity to share with you all our country's vision of ensuring a safe and decent work for our kasambahays. Next slide, please. The outline of my presentation, next slide, please, will be a glimpse of the Philippine ratification profile, the current data of domestic workers in the Philippines, the impact of the Philippine ratification of Convention 189 in the local setting, and finally, the challenges that we face in the country with respect to our kasambahays. Next slide, please. So the Philippines has ratified all the 8 core conventions of the ILO, 28 technical conventions, and 2 governance conventions. The Philippines was the second ILO member state next to Uruguay and the first in Asia that ratified Convention 189 in 2012. The adoption of the significant treaty is a welcome development for countries like ours, as we have a significant number of domestic workers in precarious working conditions. Further, we saw the need to ratify this convention to make it come to force, to enact laws and adopt policies towards safer workplaces for all our domestic workers. Next slide. Based on the Kasambahay Rider Survey results released in December 2020, there are a total of 1.4 million Filipinos working as kasambahay. Of this figure, 1.005 million are in a live-out arrangement, while more than 394,000 are living in with their employers. Meantime, 9 out of 10, or about 1.3 million of the kasambahays, are female. Now, what are the changes or impact brought about by the Philippine ratification of Convention 189? Next slide. A year after the ratification of Convention 189, the Philippines enacted Republic Act number 10361, or the Batas Kasambahay of 2013, and its implementing rules and regulations. This law provides for the basic rights of kasambahays, minimum wage, benefits, and the terms of conditions of the employment that should be stipulated in their contracts, among others. Next slide. With the enactment of the law, widespread attention has been given toward addressing the high levels of informal work among domestic workers. It has contributed to the promotion of decent work in the sector, as well as educating the public of the rights of our domestic workers. This is recognized as one of the positive impacts of the legislation by the participants during the stakeholders workshop towards a participatory impact assessment of RA 10361 in 2015, and in the initial assessment and planning workshop on decent work for domestic workers in 2016. One of the more recent undertakings of the Philippines in campaigning for decent work for domestic workers is the launching of the hashtag Para Kay Kay of DOLE through the Bureau of Workers with Special Concerns. This is an initiative for the continued promotion, advocacy of rights, and other assistance for all kasambahay across the country. Next slide. On minimum wage, Batas Kasambahay mandates that the wage of kasambahays for SCR should not be lower than 2,000 pesos for chartered and first-class municipalities and 1,500 for other municipalities. Next slide. The National Wages and Productivity Commission and the Regional Tripartite Wages and Productivity Boards released in June 2021, the minimum wage for domestic workers. For NCR, the minimum wage is 5,000 pesos, while for the other municipalities, it is from 2,000 to 4,500. Moving on to the next slide, still on minimum wage, the Kasambahay Rider Survey was able to capture that the average monthly salary of Kasambahays is 4,571. Next slide. On minimum age of employment, the Batas Kasambahay states that the minimum age to employ a Kasambahay is 15 years old and above. Specifically, Article 3 of Section 16 of RA 10361 states that it is unlawful to employ a Kasambahay below 15 years of age. Next slide. The result of the survey shows that most of the Kasambahays are in the age bracket of 46 years old and older. While it is worthy to note that there are just a few children being employed as Kasambahays who are below 15 years old. The next slide will show the impact on education and training. The enactment of Batas Kasambahay has enabled domestic workers to better access education and training opportunities. It is expected that having this access would contribute to the enhancement of their skills, which could strengthen the promotion of professionalization of domestic work or provide more career opportunities for them in the future. Moving on, the Occupational Safety and Health Center has been providing assistance to the department and to various stakeholders concerned on the safety and health of our Kasambahay since the enactment of the law by conducting learning session on OSTIPs para sa mga Kasambahay. And they have likewise developed a brochure, both hard copy and electronic, that will be helpful in educating our Kasambahays on how to remain safe and healthy while doing household chores. Next, Rule 10, Section 2 of the Batas Kasambahay prohibits any act committed by an employer or any member of his household against any Kasambahay which results in or likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, and economic harm or abuse. Correspondingly, the participant during the stakeholders workshop held in 2015 also cited that the law has significantly contributed to laying down the foundation for the protection of Kasambahay against illegal recruitment and human trafficking. It could be noted that DOLE, in consultation with concerned partners and stakeholders, have also been assessing issuances relative to the regulation of activities of private recruitment and placement agencies who are engaged in the recruitment and placement of persons for local employment. Next slide. Under Rule 4, Section 17 of the IRR of Batas Kasambahay, the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining are stipulated. A mechanism provided by the law to ensure adequate representation of the Kasambahay in social dialogue is through the Regional Tripartite Industrial Peace Council. It can be noted that there are also existing domestic workers organizations in the Philippines, such as United and Alliance of Workers in the Informal Economy or Sector Kasambahay Chapter, who serve as active partners in the promotion and implementation of Batas Kasambahay and advocating for the overall well-being of domestic workers. Next slide. What are the challenges that we face? Unemployment contract. Survey shows that only 2.5% or more than 35,000 Kasambahays are employed with employment contract. The Batas Kasambahay mandates that all our domestic workers being employed should have an employment contract, and the domestic workers shall be provided a copy of the duly signed contract. Next slide, please. On working hours, the challenge is that most Kasambahays are saddled by long working hours with not enough rest, most especially those that are living in with their employers. Most live-in domestic workers clock in 9 to 12 hours of work per day. Next slide. And lastly, on social protection. Based on the Kasambahay Rider Survey, most of the Kasambahays are not covered with any social welfare benefits. On the average, 83% of domestic workers are not covered. Kasambahay who has rendered at least 1 month of service should be covered by the Social Security System or SSS, Employees Compensation Commission ECC, the PhilHealth, and the Home Development Mutual Fund or Pag-ibig, which shall be entitled to all benefits in accordance with the respective laws, rules, and regulations. Most Kasambahays have no PhilHealth, Pag-ibig contributions, and others. Next slide. Before I end this presentation, allow me to just give a bit of way forward for us with respect to our kasambahay. First, we must intensify advocacy efforts in the promotion of the provisions of the law to further reach its clientele and improve administrative mechanisms with concerned government agencies and local government units on kasambahay registration in the barangay, SSS, PhilHealth, and Pag-ibig Fund. That ends my presentation. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Director Visperas. It is absolutely fantastic to have the Philippines example to show us what is actually possible when our governments commit to domestic worker issues. And there are so many rich lessons learned in that very fast tour through the progress in the Philippines. Thank you so much. But for another perspective for the overseas Filipino domestic workers, we're going to turn now to our final speaker on the panel, Liesl Galdo, who's the AMPO coordinator. Liesl has been working as a migrant domestic worker for over 15 years, 6 years in Kuwait and 9 years in Malaysia. She was one of the first 4 founding domestic worker leaders who established the AMPO, a Filipino migrant domestic worker membership-based organization in Malaysia. AMPO was recognized by the Philippines Embassy in June of 2016. And as one of the leaders, Liesl coordinates AMPO's activities, building up the domestic worker leadership to do organizing, case handling, training, and education to domestic workers on their rights. Liesl, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And good afternoon, everyone. I would like to say thank you for inviting me and for giving the chance to speak. It's really good to hear Miss Alice Vispera's presentation. Okay, I would like to start by sharing with you the history of AMPO. As you mentioned, Anna, that we are recognized by our embassy here on June 16, June 19, 2016. But actually, we tried to apply for a recognition in our embassy earlier 2015. But because we apply as a union, and after 8 months, we received a rejection. Because they don't want any migrant domestic workers organize a union here in Malaysia. Although we know in Malaysian government that a domestic worker or a migrant domestic worker cannot organize a union because we are, or domestic worker is not recognized as a worker in Malaysia, because in their Employment Act, we are domestic servants. So with that, we tried to, restructure our organization and called it an associations for us to be recognized in our embassy. So with that, even before we are recognized, we already tried to organizing migrant domestic workers because there's a lot of violations for the rights of the migrant domestic workers. Like withholding of passport is very rampant, late salary or even without salary, and no rest days or even days off. And especially this time of pandemic, where there's a rampant discrimination, like the employer will say the domestic worker cannot go out or cannot take their day off, but they are not compensated. But then they still allow their domestic workers to go to the market to buy the essential goods for the family. And also in the house of the employer still inviting friends or families coming in and out of the house. So that's very discriminatory, because why why they can freely move, and why the domestic worker is not. Even like there's a lot of domestic workers for the whole year, they cannot go out with this kind of discrimination, and not to mention the mental health disruptions of the migrant domestic workers, the legal disputes, and this all forms of abuse. And also in our contract, it says there that we domestic workers are only allowed 8 hours rest. But even though with that is still some domestic workers sleep less than 8 hours. As you can see, when they start working 5 o'clock in the morning and sleep 12 o'clock in the evening. So, you know, where's the 8 hours that's stated in the contract? So how we union or association can help address this issue by organizing more and more migrant domestic workers into unions and associations. It's a very challenging role, especially this time of pandemic. If we can say before the pandemic, we're already facing difficulties in our organizing. It becomes more difficult nowadays. But we will not stop there. When people think that they don't need to fight for their rights, or rather, they don't know that having 2 Sundays off in a month is not a problem, since their employer treated them like family. Then there's a lot of explanations that we are going to do, educations to this kind of people, for them to know their rights. There's a lot of work to do because any time of the day, their employer may fire them. That's why we really have to work hard on explaining to them about what is the basic rights. We also facilitate legal and personal needs, mutual help, sharing, counseling, fostering family and sisterhood. Last year, when we are giving food aid to our members, or even not a member of the union, help us more in our organizing these days. A union can be as formal representation who can sit down and who causes aiding legislations. Of course, when there is unity, there is power. Speaking truth to power. We use mass and united power to the workers to level discussions with wall high employers, states, and others. And with that, we're looking forward for the Malaysian government to recognize the domestic workers as workers. I end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liesl, for highlighting, I guess, some of the challenges that are shared not only in Malaysia around registration of domestic workers and migrant domestic workers, unions and organizations, but certainly in other country contexts in this region as well. And indeed, some of the discriminatory tactics that are used to ensure that domestic workers are not able to enjoy their rights. Very much appreciated. And to all of our speakers today, thank you for demonstrating the breadth of domestic workers' issues and the diversity of efforts that are going to be needed to meet some of the remaining challenges. We're going to move now into the question and answer session, and I hope that all of our panelists will be able to potentially input into some of these questions. Please type your questions into the chat box or raise your hand if you would prefer to speak. We have already, in fact, received a question in the chat box from Punsap, from a good friend of ours from HomeNet here in Thailand. And the question is directed to all of the panelists and asks, even though there is progress in the protection of rights of domestic workers in Asia, it is slow moving. And what are the main obstacles that are blocking those improvements of the rights? I think perhaps it will be easiest to go in speaker order. So Claire, would you like to give that one a shot first off? And then we'll move through Fish, Alice, and perhaps some lessons again from Lisa. So to you, Claire, if you're available.
Yep, thanks, Anna. I'm here. I'm sorry, though, because there was a break in the connection. If you could just repeat the question.
Certainly. The progress on protection of the rights of domestic workers is slow moving in Asia. And what do you think are some of the main obstacles that are blocking this progress?
Sure, thanks. So I think that the last speakers really made the point about how important it is to promote the organization of domestic workers. I think in a lot of countries where we've seen progress, it has been absolutely because of the leadership of domestic workers within their organizations and the support of trade unions to really push for the labor law reforms. I don't think that we can underestimate how important that organizing is. So I know that this is putting a lot of weight and responsibility on the shoulders of domestic workers organizations. And so therefore, I think it's equally important to create the support network that they need in order to push and advocate for these laws and policies. So again, just to take a step back, I think as we saw, the next step is genuinely legal protection and figuring out how to push for that, those legal reforms is really the question that's being posed here, in my opinion. So organizing is definitely one area. I think really building broad-based alliances with the larger labor movement and really trying to seek opportunities to change the laws in various areas is really one of the key aspects. A second aspect that I think is important to push for is, I think, the public awareness and advocacy campaigns that are directed towards employers of domestic workers, directed towards households, are equally important to change the mindsets of everyone in society, including policymakers. I think it's still at a stage where, although domestic work is recognized as real work in many countries and among a growing number of people, there's still a sense that domestic work is not yet really real work that's deserving of labor protections. So in terms of how to make those public awareness campaigns more effective, I think that there's more research and work that can be done in figuring out, the role and contributions of domestic workers within the care economy. So I think it's an area of argumentation that can be very effective, as we heard in the opening remarks from our regional director, that you have an important, need for care in the future. We will all need care. And it is on the governments of countries to consider how those care needs are going to be met. So I think it's a strategic opportunity to make the point that domestic workers are always going to play an important role. When we say that a lot of domestic workers are placed by or through service providers, part of why we think that's so important is because a lot of care is provided through service providers currently. And the people who are working through those service providers can be seen as domestic workers from the perspective of the ILO convention. So really broadening the understanding of what domestic workers do and their role in supporting households as part of, as we're calling it more and more often, as part of the care infrastructure that supports households, is I think a direction that we can go in to help build up a little bit more will and understanding, and highlight the urgency and the importance of formalizing domestic work. These are just two areas that come to mind.
Thank you, Claire. Fish, did you want to respond to that question as well?
Yes, I think, yeah, it's true that we are still very slow in Asia and we face a lot of obstacles. Because domestic workers employers are the general public in some countries like Singapore, it's like 1 out of 6 households hiring a migrant domestic workers. In Hong Kong is 1 out of 8. So when we are talking about employers, it's like the general public. So that's why the role of the government in having legal protection, as Claire has said, is very important. Having awareness raising among the public to recognize domestic workers instead of maids and servants are so important. Although we have domestic workers organized, but the number is still far little because our organizing in the region is very, very young. Most of them are organized in the past a little bit more than a decade. So I think it is important we can have our trade union partners to fight for freedom of association for domestic workers, to allow them to be organized and especially allow them to have a day off so that we can reach out to domestic workers more easier, to provide them training and education so that we can have our organizing easier. Yeah, so I think there are many sisters here, brothers here, domestic workers leaders as well. I think you can please also share your thoughts.
Thanks, Fish. I'm going to hand over quickly to Alice to see if she can tell us what really works.
Thank you, Anna. I think one of the impediments is the lack of information of most of our domestic workers, specifically regarding to their rights and what they should be getting from their employers. Also, another block or roadblock to the effective implementation is the lack of administrative mechanisms among concerned agencies, specifically with regards to the registration of our domestic workers at the barangay level or the smallest unit of the society, and even in the social protection system like our social security system, our PhilHealth, our pag-ibig. So they are not very well protected as far as social security rights are concerned. That's it.
Thanks, Alice. Liesl, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah. I think first and foremost is the legislators, because they are employers. So, and also those in trade unions, they're also employers with domestic workers. So, that's why it's very, very slow. Even though C189 is already 10 years, but still, like here in Asia, it's only one country that ratified the C189, because mostly those legislators is employers. So that's why it's very, very slow. I think it explains everything. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much. I think there's a couple of common threads going through perhaps the question and definitely through all of the answers, that we need to reconfigure a bit our thinking around domestic work and the contribution that domestic workers make within the care economy and within our society, and what kind of value we as members of the society, but also as policymakers, as employers, and as legislators actually place on domestic work and their role within the community. And of course, it is incumbent on all of us on this call, not just those who are representing domestic workers organizations, to ensure that domestic workers can organize and can organize better and more effectively. And certainly from the ILO's perspective, we we can do a lot more to continue to support those organizing efforts. And I hope that all of the colleagues on the call will consider that in future, and particularly how they can support organizing efforts in this 10th anniversary year. For Kun Punsap, it was such a good question that I think we used up almost all of our question and answer sessions. So I hope you are pleased with that question. For anybody else who has some questions they would like to have answered, please don't hesitate to email us. If it's a matter of data and so on, we can liaise with Claire and with Florence and get back to you with an answer. We're happy to provide those connections. So if there are some burning issues that have remained unanswered, I'm sorry, but please feel free and we will try and follow up on those in future. However, due to the time, I want to continue moving on to the next session of our event here today. The next session, in fact, underscores how critical it is that governments, employers, and domestic workers, unions, and civil society actors all come together to advocate for improvements in the domestic work sector. And we've worked with many familiar faces to produce this video that will demonstrate some of these shared messages. I will hand over to my colleagues to begin screen sharing of this domestic workers video. And we will also put in the chat box a place where you can download the video and start to share it on your own social media channels and with your own networks, and continue to advocate for domestic workers' rights on those channels. Kun A and Kun Ning, are you able to share the video now? Please bear with us. This was always going to be the pressure point in this event, and a familiar face to start off with. I think we need the sound. Ning, I think we need to go back and turn the sound sharing on as well, please.
If the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it's the importance of our homes, as shelter, as sanctuary, and as workplaces.
Regular boundaries between our work and private life have become blurred.
Pero alam lagi ito ng mga kasamaan.
Employers often say that domestic workers are treated just like one of the family.
จะအမြဲတမ်းမမနိုင်တယ်လို့အပြုသူပြောလည်းအများမဆောင်ဘူး
ในความเป็นจริงแล้วสำหรับที่งานที่เฮ็ดเวียกในครัวเรือนส่วนใหญ่แม่นบ่ได้รับความรักและความเท่าเทียมคือกับสมาชิกในครอบครัว
Thường chúng tôi không có ngày nghỉ.
Kerja terlalu banyak.
ค่าจ้างที่ได้รับก็มักจะจ่ายช้า หรือไม่ก็ต่ำเกินไป
Hindi makakatawag sa pamilya sa Pilipinas.
នឹងទទួលអំពើហិង្សានិងការបៀតបៀន
This is unacceptable.
Ini tidak dapat diterima.
This is unacceptable.
แต่สำหรับเราหลายๆคนนี่คือความเป็นจริง
2021 marks the 10th anniversary of the adoption of ILO Domestic Workers Convention 189, a groundbreaking moment which affirmed that domestic work is work.
ပြီးတော့အေကူလသမန်များမှာခြားလသမန်များကဲ့သို့ဒီဒီတော့ကပဲဆောက်ရှောက်မှုများခံစားနိုင်ပြီးရှိပါတယ်
But we haven't come far enough in the last decade.
We are still fighting to ensure that domestic workers are able to enjoy work that is dignified, profitable, and humane.
It's time that all domestic workers are recognized for the contributions they make.
We urge governments to ratify Convention 189.
Kita menggalakkan majikan-majikan untuk memperbaiki keadaan kerja di rumah mereka.
We stand with domestic workers around the world fighting for their rights.
Let us together create fair homes where decent work is reality for all.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. You will have seen that we have the link to that video in the chat. Please do download it and please do begin to share it with all of your social media networks. I know you have vast and varied networks and it would be great to see that video going much further. A huge thank you, of course, before we move on to the ILO's communications team who put that video together, especially Kun Jirapon. It was, as you can imagine, quite an effort. And I think it's so important to see all of those faces and for us to be visible in our support to domestic workers, especially as we're trying to combat the invisibility of domestic work. It was wonderful to see your beautiful faces in that product. Before we close, I want to thank you all again for coming and recognize the support of the Triangle and ASEAN funding partners, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Global Affairs Canada. And I want to recall something that Kun Pin spoke about in her opening remarks, the fact that domestic work is personal. So I leave you all with a personal parting challenge for you to identify 3 things that you can do personally to encourage action to improve the conditions in domestic work. Please commit yourselves to 1 thing that you can do today. Perhaps it's just tweeting or a post on social media, sharing the ILO report or sharing the video that you just saw. Please commit yourselves to 2 things that you can do this week. For example, you could consider your own domestic work contract if you have one, or reach out to the organization, your organization about a standard contract or setting minimum standards for domestic workers employed by the staff at your organization. Perhaps you could read the convention or read a publication, and we've included the link there for ILO's resource guide. And 3 things, we challenge you to do 3 things this anniversary year in celebration of the 10 years of C189. Perhaps you could approach a donor about a funding gap related to domestic work in your country, or launch a campaign on decent work for domestic workers, or even do some research on an issue related to domestic work. We had over 250 people registered to participate in this call today. And if we're all able to do 1 thing today, 2 things this week, and 3 things this year, I hope that when we come together next year for the 11th anniversary of the convention adoption, we will see a very different and even more active picture of domestic worker advocacy across this region. So I very much look forward to seeing you all next year and hearing about all of your activities. Before we close, I want to thank our wonderful team of translators who were able to attend this event and were able to make this event, like the domestic workers movement, truly global. Thank you so much for your efforts. We can't do this without you. And thanks also to IDWF who were able to arrange additional pieces of additional translators for other languages. That was fantastic. I'd like to also give a special thanks to our administrative team who worked so hard behind the scenes. Kun Ning and Kun A, we are in your debt as always. I look forward to seeing you all again next year, and I'm very grateful for your time today. And please don't hesitate to get in touch over the next days, weeks, hours, and all year. We'd be happy to help move the needle on domestic work in the Asia Pacific region. My gratitude to all of you, and to all of you, a very, very happy Domestic Workers' Day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Ratify, ratify, C189.
Ratify, 189. 9.
Everyone.
Keep safe, everyone.
Safe, everyone.
Selamat Hari Pekerja Rumah Tangga Sedunia.
Selamat.
Happy International Domestic Workers.
Happy International Domestic
One
Workers, everyone.
International Domestic Workers Day. Domestic work is the big center of ratify.
See you soon, everyone.
Ratify.
Goodbye.
Bye,
C1 is
everyone.
9. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye everyone. Bye.